Council in Ottawa. And today we will be talking to you about the Ottawa Neighbourhood Study. So we'll tell you all about what that is and how we developed an interactive housing profile in ArcGIS Story Map that brought together data from various sources. So let's get into it. Next slide, please, Anzo. Okay, so we will start by introducing the Ottawa Neighbourhood Study, methodology, what it is, how we deal with knowledge mobilization, and then we'll get into the housing project itself. So I'm going to start off with an overview of the program that Anzo and I work in at the University of Ottawa, and then I'll hand over to Anzo, and Anzo will take you through the specific housing project that led to this story map. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so what is ONS, the Ottawa Neighbourhood Study? So the Ottawa Neighbourhood Study is based at the University of Ottawa. It started in 2006, and it is a research and data program that brings together comprehensive neighborhood level data in Ottawa, and it's specifically focused around the determinants of health, but more broadly looks at anything really that can affect your health and well-being or your experience living in your neighborhood. It's used by stakeholders in Ottawa, by planners and decision makers to inform decision making using data. And it allows stakeholders to identify specific needs in neighborhoods and to more efficiently sort of prioritize or allocate resources across the city, as well as to be able to advocate for services. We also, in 2021, incorporated a not-for-profit organization that has charitable status now. And so this was because the ONS started as a research project at the university. So it was a CIHR-funded grant that looked to define neighborhoods and gather data on the social determinants of health, but it became a resource in the community that became continuously funded. And so then it became sort of a program of its own within the university, but without any kind of formal identity or entity. And so we incorporated more recently in 2021, and we have sort of a sister organization that is a legal entity through which we can apply for different types of funding. So we're eligible for like foundation funds and other types of funding that we then contract with the university essentially to run the program. So I'm going to talk to you about the four kind of main components of ONS. The first one being the community-driven neighborhoods, the second one being the neighborhood data, the third being the research and analytics, or sorry, analytics as well, and analysis, and the fourth being that knowledge translation and transfer and the community partnerships. Next slide, please, Anzo. Okay, so the community-driven neighborhoods, this is probably one of the distinguishing characteristics of the research program of the Ottawa Neighbourhood Study. So the neighborhoods themselves are not any standard geographies or clusters of standard geographies like census tracts or dissemination areas. They're also not any type of political boundaries like our municipal wards. They're not based on postal codes. So they really are truly custom geographies. And anyone who has put in a custom geography request at the CDP knows exactly what those are. But so essentially they were drawn on maps, and this is back in 2006. You can see a picture there of the actual physical drawing. Since then, we've used more advanced geospatial tools to do the mapping, but they are community driven. So the first step in defining the neighborhoods, which was the sort of the first step that was needed in being able to collect data for the neighborhoods, was to first look at a very small level at dissemination areas, look at demographics of the population to identify where there were similarities in population demographics and characteristics, so that we could try to avoid clustering together in a single neighborhood groups of population that were very different, because that would prevent us from being able to see where there were specific needs in the community or specific differences that maybe have an impact on the challenges that residents face in neighborhoods, on the opportunities, and on the specific needs. So the first step was looking at data to identify where there were kind of clusters of similar demographics. And then the second step so included in that first step, of course, was also looking at natural barriers and boundaries like highways and water. And then the second step was using the community themselves to help define the neighborhoods, and that's a really important part of the process of coming up with these neighborhoods. Was really, we wanted to make sure that the neighborhoods reflected the community's identity with their neighborhood. So we wanted them to have a name that the community recognizes as their neighborhood, and to have a meaning to residents. So we had a community consultation that involved community members, community associations, counselors, service providers that have a very strong understanding of the neighborhoods themselves. And that came together essentially to form the neighborhoods that we have. And so this was back in 2006 when things started. Since then, we have revised the boundaries several times. Every 5 to 10 years, in alignment with a census cycle, we will review the neighborhood boundaries to make sure that they are keeping up with population growth and migration, densification, gentrification, and essentially to make sure that the neighborhoods are evolving with the community as well. And so the outcome of this kind of primary feature of this research project or program rather, is that the neighborhoods have that local contextual relevance. And so we also are able to capture the social constructs of neighborhoods, and it allows for some better unique identification of unique neighborhood needs. It encourages community engagement and participation in local planning, so residents get involved with some of the research and some of the planning, and are really engaged when we use these neighborhoods in dissemination. And overall, it's really helped to increase collaboration because many service providers have adopted these neighborhood boundaries themselves for their own service delivery models. And so it's really helped with the communication around data, and we'll get into the knowledge transfer and translation piece in a second. So next slide, please. So the second component is the neighborhood data, and this is the part where we bring together all kinds of data from various sources to the common geographical reference point, which is the neighborhood. So you can kind of see in the background there the outline of the neighborhood boundaries. So we bring together data from a variety of sources. You can see some of them there. StatsCan through the community data program is one of the major sources of data that we bring together, and that's where we get all of our demographic data. We also collect data on social aspects, economic access to services and resources. So in addition to who's living in the neighborhoods, we look at what kind of access do they have to the facilities in the neighborhood or to the grocery stores? What's the average distance that they need to travel to get to the nearest grocery store, for example? We look at crime and safety, just about anything really that can affect residents' experiences and health and well-being in neighborhoods, including transportation and primary care access. So what this does is it paints a holistic picture of what's happening in neighborhoods, and it puts everything in one place that stakeholders can then go to really find out everything that's happening in a neighborhood in a single place. So some of the other sources of data include the City of Ottawa. Our city has an open data portal that is quite useful. ICES, the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, and OCHPP, the Ontario Community Health Profiles Partnership, where administrative health data sets are stored and analyzed. We do also collect data from OpenStreetMap, and that's a source that we've started leveraging more recently and more frequently, in addition to us pushing data onto OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap, for anyone who doesn't know, is a crowdsourced platform for point level data. So where are all the grocery stores? Well, it helps when the community can help let you know that the grocery store that was in their neighborhood shut down or moved across the street. So we do web scraping, essentially to get the location of different facilities in a more efficient way than having a research assistant spend 1,000 hours collecting each record individually. Some primary data collection as well. So we have had students walk streets in neighborhoods with a checklist for walkability, seeing, are the streets safe from traffic? What's the pedestrian infrastructure like? Is there litter and graffiti? Or so we have collected data firsthand as well. We do some remote sensing and machine learning. So we've used like Google Street View images, for example, to analyze different characteristics of neighborhoods that can be qualitatively assessed from Google Street View. Next slide, please. So the third component, research and analysis. So being a program at the University of Ottawa, research is one of our foci, and so we do apply for research grants that are around neighborhoods and health and well-being, and so some of those are CIHR, like Healthy City grants, for example, and we do conduct some research on using all of the data that's available now in one place, and so this includes, some statistical analyses, descriptive, a little bit of predictive, but mostly descriptive, composite measures. So we have an index that is probably the most commonly used. There's like a single measure that most of our stakeholders rely on the most, and it's the SES index. And so it's a composite measure that uses a variety of different census profile indicators. And it's a principal component analysis that puts them together in a single output of which ends up being a relative socioeconomic disadvantage score. So it's a quintile measure from 1 to 5. And so that's one example of kind of, using several indicators together and into a single output at a neighborhood level that's been very useful in the community. Geospatial analyses is one of the primary, tools that we use. So we use ArcGIS and QGIS, mostly ArcGIS, to do things like proximity analyses and distance metrics and cost analyses. And we'll also use programs like R and Python to do things like, for example, you can see on the right, it's an image showing one of the projects that we were working on in R. So it's an example that uses this, in this case it was libraries. So if libraries are intended to cover a 10-minute walking radius or isochrome, how many residents are not covered? And then the next question was, if we had one more library that we could put anywhere, where would it be so that it would cover the most residents, or so that it could, make more neighborhoods meet their sort of threshold criteria. So some different optimization algorithms as well. Next slide, please.
Okay,
And
excuse me, there's a question.
yes.
Is there an additional cost to requesting census data for custom geographies? As well, what is the timeline to get the data from StatsCan? Okay,
excellent question. So in terms of the timeline, we don't ever know exactly when the data is coming. So what we do know is that it's going to come after the standard geographies are released. So we know that as long as the standard geographies have not been released yet for the general census profile, that we're still going to be waiting. But this last, in the 2021 census cycle, it was much quicker than in the previous. In the 2016, it did take, so it takes about a year, I would say, after the actual census date at least. This time it actually came pretty quickly after the standard geographies, but we don't have like a schedule, right? They do have a release schedule StatsCan has in general, but through the CDP, for custom geographies specifically, we don't really know exactly when they're going to come. In terms of cost, so we pay a membership fee to be part of the Ottawa Regional Data Consortium, and the membership fees are not based, at least for the Ottawa Regional Consortium, are not based on whether you have standard or custom requests. I don't think. I think that it's more so based on the size of the organization, and their ability to contribute financial resources to the consortium. So in that sense, there hasn't been an extra cost for us in having the custom geographies, if you're not counting the cost of coming up with the geographies, revising them with the community, and then doing extra work to get other data sets that aren't available for custom geographies. So a lot of data is made available for standard census geographies because they're so commonly used. And so we will often have to work around that, do weighting methods or redo analyses for custom geographies that we may otherwise have not had to do. So maybe that was a longer answer than needed, so sorry about that. I'll continue unless I hear. Okay, great. So knowledge translation and transfer and community partnerships are a really big part of the program and what makes it successful and used. So we have our primary dissemination tool is our website. It's neighbourhoodstudy.ca. If you visit it now, know that it is currently under development and that it's getting a makeover soon. So please don't judge its current appearance. We are making it more user friendly and more attractive. But for now, that is the main tool that we have. There's a map page where we display different variables at the neighborhood level using a choropleth map. We also use Tableau and Power BI and infographics and story maps. So Anzo is going to take us through the story map. And we have many ongoing collaborations with stakeholders and different community partners that really guide the research and the dissemination of the research. So we're continuously wanting to know how can we display data or make data available in a way that will be useful in informing decisions in the community. And so over the 15, 20 years that we've built these partnerships in the community, it's led to many organizations adopting the neighborhood boundaries themselves. So like our local police service uses these neighborhoods as clusters of the neighborhoods as their police zones. Our public health unit uses these neighborhoods for their intervention, planning, emergency protective services. So there are many different organizations that now use them, which has made them even more useful in the community. And I will now hand over to my colleague Anzo, who will take you through a great example of partnerships and using data to tell a story.
Thanks, Katie. So I'm just going to say in advance, I've still got a bit of a cough from a cold I had last week, so apologies in advance if it comes up. But in any case, I'm going to talk about our recent housing project and housing story map, which we developed in partnership with Dr. Claire Kendall and her team at the Berea Research Institute. And this was a project funded by CIHR through the Healthy Cities Research Initiative. And so, like Katie mentioned, this housing story map illustrates really nicely how the neighborhood construct can be used to bring together meaningful data and tell a data story that's relevant to the community. So, as is the case with almost every major city in Canada, Ottawa has been facing a housing crisis in recent years, to the point where in 2020, the municipal government declared a housing and homelessness emergency. And so we see here on this slide that housing has many different dimensions and aspects, and they all make up the housing landscape of Ottawa. But the problem is that the issue is that the data around these different housing topics are siloed, represented here with each bubble being its own different color and not really linked to each other. There's this disjointed ecosystem of different data stewards and metadata, data standards, and so on. And this prevents a big picture understanding of housing inequities, which in turn limits decision-making capacity on the city's housing challenges. So our goal is to break down the silos and gather data relating to all of these aspects into one place for interpretation and dissemination. So to give an overview of the project, we identified and acquired housing data through a variety of means, including the community data program, of course, as well as individual data agreements, open access sources, and through the Research Data Center, which is a Statistics Canada facility that lets us go in and analyze the raw microdata of specific data sets. So in this case, we went in to analyze the microdata of the Canadian Housing Statistics Program, which was a new registry of residential properties. So after acquiring the data, we then created data visualizations and summarized descriptive statistics from which we could draw insights to include in maps, infographic, and data storytelling narratives. Finally, we disseminated the data with the goal of creating an engaging story that we could tell to a broad audience. And we'll touch on that more in a bit when we delve into detail with the story map. And throughout the entire process of a project, we try to use natural neighborhoods and our neighborhood construct whenever possible as the common geographic reference point. So this slide here illustrates the wide variety of data that we sought to acquire for the project. There were a few data sets listed here that we ended up not using, mostly because some of these had reference periods that were too old. But as you can see, we acquired data to try and cover the whole spectrum of housing, ranging from data on home ownership from the Housing Statistics Program to market conditions, which we did from, there's a little bit of that in the census, but also from rental data scraping from sites such as Kijiji, PadMapper, rentals.ca. We also had data on social housing from the city of Ottawa, and also data on experiences and shelter stay when it comes to data on homelessness. That comes from the point in time count of homelessness, as well as the city of Ottawa's homeless individuals and families information system. And as well, wider neighborhood proximity data to contextualize all this within that neighborhood construct. So when it came to data from the CDP, there were two main data sets relevant to this project that we acquired through the CDP. One is the 2021 census profile by ONS neighborhood, as we did put in that request for custom geographies. In addition, we acquired 2021 census target group profiles for specific populations. And so these are the census profile, but the universe is a specific population, such as the Indigenous community or the visible minority population. We also received target group profiles for various age groups, people living in low income, and newcomers to Canada. And so these TGPs really allowed us to better understand inequities between populations within the city. And also we acquired mortgage debt data from TransUnion through the CDP as well. So throughout the project, we collaborated closely with an advisory group of partner organizations, which included the City of Ottawa, as well as advocacy organizations, service providers, and local nonprofits. And this was really valuable to create these collaborations because we at ONS didn't really have an ear to the ground domain expertise in housing. So by working with our partners, we collaborated so that they would provide us feedback and advice on how these data can be used and most meaningfully represented in ways that are useful to them and useful to stakeholders. And in addition, by having an advisory group, it fostered inter-organizational collaboration and different connections that helped us learn more about other housing projects going on in the area so that we could better understand the housing research landscape in that regard. And also it helped us minimize any duplication of efforts that other groups might be working on when it came to housing. So now we have all of these data collected and we've made a lot of charts, maps, and graphs. But going back to what I touched on a few slides ago, how do we disseminate all of this? So we were looking for a way to reach a broad audience, to combine different types of visuals. We also wanted to have an immersive and engaging reader experience, something that readers, whether they're really interested in the details of data or if they just want the highlights, anyone could be interested in. And so with all of that in mind, we decided to use ArcGIS story maps as the program so that we could create this dynamic data story. So to give a little bit more detail, ArcGIS Story Maps, it's a proprietary software by Esri, the same company behind all of the ArcGIS suite of software. And it's this online application used to create immersive map-based narratives. Now, the key conceit of Story Maps is that it integrates text and maps embedded on the same immersive web page, so that annotations and accompanying text can complement on-screen visuals that you can embed that you make in other programs, or you can even make in ArcGIS Online. And so because you can embed those other visuals, you can have, for example, text on one side that provides high-level highlights and narrative context, and on the other side, maps or graphs that show the more detailed data and a visual aid for the data story. So what we're showing here on this slide are sort of the ingredients that went into our story map. On the left side are the elements we created using other software and then embedded into the story map. So we have maps made in ArcGIS Pro, we had infographics and some other static graphics made in PowerPoint, and interactive graphs and dashboard that we made in Tableau Desktop. We also linked to some externally hosted dashboards and infographics that the City of Ottawa already created using housing data that they had access to, so we could leverage resources already available with our partners. And finally, within the story map, we wrote accompanying text that would provide the overarching narrative and highlight key data. I'm just gonna drink water real quickly. Okay, so for ArcGIS story maps, with our experience of using it, there were a couple of pros and cons. So for pros, the first thing is it really does create this kind of immersive experience for the reader when it comes to taking you through a data narrative. And we found that it is something that can be quite accessible to general audiences. And because you're able to have, again, that sort of side-by-side of text as well as graphics that take up the whole screen, and you can scroll through it and interact with the visual elements, you can communicate both just the highlights of the data as well as the small details for people who really want to see more granular data. And in addition, when it comes to actually using ArcGIS story maps to build the data story, we found that it has a relatively user-friendly interface and a small learning curve. It's rather intuitive to use. Now, on the flip side, when it comes to challenges we found with using this software, one is that there are rather inflexible formatting and screen size options. When you're using ArcGIS story maps, there are only a few different kinds of formats you can choose from and a few preset size options when it comes to, for example, how big or small you want an image to be. And so there's not a whole lot of customization in that regard. In addition, we found it was difficult to embed a story map onto another website while preserving its kind of immersive the way that it takes up the whole website. We found that difficult to preserve when it comes to trying to embed it onto another website. For example, we tried to embed our housing story map onto the ONS website, but we found that it wasn't able to take up the whole screen. So instead, we just decided to link to the story map on its own web page that would open up instead. And so that's another challenge. And finally, we found that there is a lack of built-in version control, as we were aware. So once we make updates to the story map, we can't revert to previous versions if we need to, or we can't easily keep track of changes. There's no like built-in way to do that. So that was another challenge. So I'm going to give a quick demonstration of the story map to show everyone what it looks like in action. So I'm going to switch tabs real quick here. Just to confirm, Katie, is the
it's showing correctly? And maybe just while you're opening that up, there's a question here. Did you find the story maps were mobile and screen reader friendly?
Yes, that is one of the that is one of the issues. Is I believe they don't have any formats for mobile. So I think I tried looking at this on my phone, and then the formatting was not as user-friendly as it is on desktop. They do have, I think, some compatibility with screen readers. Like you can add text descriptions for every image that you add so that screen readers can read it out. So there is some accessibility in that manner. But I don't think, I haven't personally tested it on a screen reader, but we do have the capability to add textual descriptions of any visual elements. That's a good question, though. Thank you. So yes, for the story map, this is what it looks like. We have like a title page here starting off. And as you can see, as it scrolls down, everything on the page scrolls with it. And on the top here, we have this navigation bar that lets you skip to a specific section of the story map if you'd like to. Let's going back up to the beginning. And so we could start here. We have an introduction here. And here we could see the very first embedded graph. We made this in Tableau and then embedded it into the story map. So you can see here, you can click on it and interact with it. You can click on a bar, for example, to see the specific percentage that the bar represents. So within the context of the story map, we're talking about why housing is an issue. And one of the things we highlight here is that Ottawa is a very quickly growing city. You can see here in terms of the top 10 most populous municipalities, Ottawa is the second fastest growing, at least between the 2016 and 2021 censuses. And so you can see here, we created a graph in Tableau and then brought it into story maps. We could also see here an example of an image that we show here. We brought together a bunch of different headlines about the housing crisis in Ottawa, and we put it in the background while there's a block of text that kind of moves forward the data story that we're trying to tell here. And then we could also see as we scroll down more, here's an example of a table that you can construct and place into the story map. And then this is where we get into the really cool part, which are the maps themselves. So for example, here we're going to start talking about core housing need, which I'll also elaborate on in a little bit in the presentation. So here, for example, you can see here on the left, we have the text that just says, 11-ish% of Ottawa's households are living in core housing needs. So that's kind of the main highlight. But on the right here, we have an interactive map that we created in ArcGIS online that lets you zoom in and zoom out. You can pan through the map and you can actually click on a neighborhood, for example, this one. And you can see here, it'll give you the more detailed profile of that neighborhood when it comes to core housing need and its dimensions. So it actually tells you like exactly what percentage of households in this neighborhood are in core housing need. Also broken down by tenure. We also have some data on shelter costs, as well as the percentage of households in the different components of core housing need. And as you scroll down here, then there's another map that actually is a slider map. So this one shows two different variables on the same map that lets you compare and contrast between them. So here is a map that shows on the left, the core housing need for renter households only. And then on the right side, core housing need among owner households. And because it's on the same scale, you can compare directly and see at a glance that, wow, core housing need affects renter households at a much greater rate than owner households. And so that's another feature of ArcGIS story maps that lets you compare and contrast between data. You have text that shows like the highlights, and as well, you have the maps where if you zoom in and say click on a neighborhood, you can see the detailed profiles. So I'm going to go back to the presentation here. Are there any questions, Katie, in the chat? I can't see it right now.
None that are new yet.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks. So now I'm going to illustrate how bringing data from multiple sources can help paint a more complete picture of housing in Ottawa using that example of core housing need. So just to define it, it's a measure used by Statistics Canada and the CMHC to measure if a household lives in acceptable or unacceptable housing. So briefly, a housing is considered in core housing need if it meets one of three criteria. Either the household is unaffordable, so the household spends 30% or more of its before tax income on shelter costs, or the household needs major repairs, or the household is considered overcrowded. And in addition to meeting one of those three criteria, the household would also need to spend 30% or more of its income to find acceptable housing within the same census subdivision. And so we see here, like we saw in the story map, about 11% of households in Ottawa live in core housing need, but we see that this is driven largely by renter households. And then we see again a screenshot of what we saw in the story map showing that core housing need, but by neighborhood, so we can see and compare both the citywide high-level insights and detailed neighborhood profiles. So I'm going to delve a bit more into one of those dimensions of core housing need, which is affordability. In other words, spending 30% or more of your before tax income on housing. So in Ottawa, core housing need is largely driven by affordability issues. And as you can see on the graph, again, renter households bear a lot of the brunt here, with about 1 in 3 renter households living in unaffordable housing compared to about 1 in 5 of all households from the 2021 census. And so what the census also does is tracks shelter costs. So in 2021, they recorded the median monthly shelter cost for renters at around $1,380 a month. However, the median shelter costs recorded by the census are the rents for all households currently renting. So they don't really reflect the current or more recent market conditions for households who are looking for a place to live, for example. And so we need to look beyond just census data to have this more complete picture of affordability for rental households. And this is especially the case for a province like Ontario, where there's rent controls. And so households with rent controls who, for example, have been living in that apartment for 20 or 25 years their rents will definitely not be reflective of the current housing market. And so to fill that gap, we scraped data from some major rental websites like Kijiji, PadMapper, Rentals.ca, and MLS listings to aggregate rents and available listings between December 2022 and April 2023. And it's actually still an ongoing project. And we did this to aggregate rents and to better understand the current market conditions of the rental markets, so we can have a better picture of rental affordability for households that, for example, need to move or are moving to Ottawa. And so you can see in this example here, this graph shows from that data we scraped over those 5 months, the median rents across the whole city of Ottawa by the unit size of the apartment. And so you can see here that for every unit size that we found the median rent was actually higher than the median monthly shelter cost recorded by the census, ranging from $1,535 a month as the median for 0-bedroom units or bachelor units, all the way up to $2,900 a month for 4+ bedroom units. And so what we see here is that there's a significant divergence between the rental market conditions if someone's looking to rent versus the mean or median rents that existing households pay according to the census. So this serves as an example of how multiple data sources can work together to provide a more complete picture of housing. And this example here we have of the rental market in our data scraping. This is also all available by neighborhood on the story map as well. So we can also have a more detailed neighborhood level view.
There's
And
one
so-
question,
yes.
a new question, Enzo, if that's okay.
Yes.
It says, I may have missed this, but how often will you update this data?
Yes, that's a good question. We were planning to update it as we receive new data. I know for the rental scraping, we had a little bit of an issue with storing the data, but I think we plan to update it sometime this year, I would imagine, since we definitely have a lot more recent rental data. The thing with the rental data specifically is that we're working in partnership with the City of Ottawa to figure out how to best figure out new ways to better analyze and disseminate that data. When it comes to other housing data, it largely depends on when we receive it. For example, census data, we could foresee in the long term updating it with 2026 data. There are some other data sources that I believe, I'm trying to think of others that might be updated more closer in the nearer future. Can't think of any off the top of my head, but there are some new housing data that we plan to add to the data story. For example, location data of social housing units in Ottawa. That's something that that's a data set that wasn't included in our original release of the data story, but we plan to add it sometime soon. So I guess to answer your question, it really depends on when we receive the data, and also it depends on our collaborations with our partners as well. So yeah, I was on that topic because carrying out a project like this could be of interest to the people, everyone here watching today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the logistics of the project. So when it came to how long it took us to create this, from starting the process of data acquisition to when we released the first version of our story map, it took about 1.5 years. And like I mentioned, we plan on updating the story map with new housing data as it comes along. When it comes to how much, when it came to people power to make this happen, it fluctuated depending on the workload and which phase of the project we were at, but generally about 0.5 to 1 full-time equivalent worth of effort was dedicated to this housing project by ONS team members. And in terms of the budget, we received a $100,000 grant from CAHR to complete our housing project. And we also received in-kind contributions from our partners, whether it was through the advisory group, or we also received in-kind translation help from the City of Ottawa. And so that's around where we were for the budget. And in terms of some expenses, Of course, licenses are really big, can be a really big budget item. Luckily for us, since we're housed at the University of Ottawa, the ArcGIS suite of software, we have institutional access to that. But otherwise, for example, an ArcGIS Pro license I checked was $1,450 a year. A Story Maps license is $950 a year. And I think like Esri has some bundles where you could combine software together, but it can still be quite expensive. Tableau license is $75 US per user per month, and that's something that we at the Ottawa Neighbourhood Study have to pay for. There's also data access costs, for example, to access microdata, for example, at the Research Data Center by Statistics Canada. Many university institutions like us would have free access to that data, but for example, governments or nonprofits may have to pay to access that data. There is also costs with the data agreements and consortium memberships. And finally, for attending conferences and posters and dissemination, that also was included in our project costs. And so to sum things up, we did result in this story map that did integrate data from many different sources using neighborhoods as a geographic reference point. And from that, we have these online resources now to better understand the housing landscape of Ottawa and its neighborhoods, not just the story map, but also most of the neighborhood level housing data that we collected, we also made available on the ONS website, neighborhoodstudy.ca, so that anyone can take a look at it. And we hope that these resources will inform decision makers in Ottawa to improve housing policy and practice. Just an example, I think our story map, last I checked last week, we had around 2,100 views for the English version and 200 views for the French version. And we've also had requests to present these findings to the City of Ottawa and the Housing Department and other related organizations. So we hope that having this wealth of data can be leveraged for housing decision making and policy making. And this can be the basis to address the issues that our city faces when it comes to housing. So that's all we had to talk about for today. So thanks. And we'd love to hear from you at our emails, and we're excited for the Q&A if people have questions.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat box or unmute your devices and feel like kind of talk about your questions. Please feel free to do that as well. In the meantime, I kind of want to introduce our next webinar, which will take place on July 10th. So I'm going to share the webinar page, and anyone is interested, so you can register for that. And also we have a MailChimp that we send it out soon about this. So if you want to be in our mailing list, please sign up for that. So this is our kind of MailChimp subscription page. So you will be kind of get updates about our webinars, any news for CDP members, events, and new data. So please, yeah, please sign up for that. Okay. Thank you so much for the link. Okay, so we have a question here coming, asking that how often do neighborhood boundaries change, and how do you plan to compare year-over-year statistics when the boundaries change?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's a challenge that we've faced. So how often do they change? We're on our third generation, Gen 3 neighborhoods, so they've changed twice since 2006, I suppose. Actually, I think there was one initial round that we didn't actually count in our generation. 3 times they've changed over 15, more like 20 years. We are hoping that this latest generation will last 10 years. We make changes when we get a lot of feedback from the community that, you know, there needs to be changes when there's been significant development. So in Ottawa, we have our urban core, and then in the rural areas, we're sort of slowly expanding outward, and there's a lot of new development that creates new neighborhoods, and often results in some neighborhoods, initial neighborhoods needing to be split because the population grew so much and really kind of developed into distinct subpopulations. In terms of comparing over the years, that's a challenge that we face, and so for the neighborhoods that haven't changed, it's not an issue. For the neighborhoods that have changed, ideally, we would receive a new extract from StatCan of using our new generation neighborhoods for the previous cycles. We weren't able to kind of work that into our deal with the with the consortium for this round, but if it were important for a specific project, like you could get access to it, right, if you paid for the request. So it's not impossible to get. It does make it more challenging for sure, and it's something that is always we need to balance between the need to have the neighborhoods evolve as Ottawa evolves, and also the strong desire to be able to look at comparisons over the years. With the 2011 NHS fiasco, it meant that we couldn't really make comparisons anyway. Like, it was recommended that you don't make comparisons to the previous year or the cycle or the following cycle. So, but now we're definitely feeling, I think, it would have been useful to be able to compare 2016 to 2021. And so maybe we'll be able to get some funding to request that data.
Awesome. Thank you. So then next question is about the data scraping. They're asking, what tools did you use for the web data scraping?
It's all done in R. We've used Python before, but R is our primary tool for data scraping and for algorithms.
And then,
Yeah.
And then the other question is kind of asking, do you plan on creating other story maps for other data collected as part of the ONS? And have you experimented with including an ArcGIS dashboard or experience builder map into story maps?
I'll hand this question over to Anzo, who, by the way, single-handedly built that story map from scratch and without even previous experience in story maps. Anyway, I'll hand this over to you, Enzo.
Thanks. So yeah, actually, we are planning on creating other story maps for other data themes. Actually, this summer we have two great practicum students from U Ottawa who are working with us to create two new data stories. One is on the food environment, and there's going to be analysis of food swamps and food deserts, I believe, as well as the food retail environment around schools as well, like examining the prevalence of unhealthy food options around schools. And that's one of them. The other one is going to be on heat vulnerability, especially in the context of climate change. And so it's going to be an analysis of heat exposure and vulnerability, as well as the protective factors for heat mitigation, such as splash pads, swimming pools, public indoor spaces that are air conditioned, and so on. And that's going to be another story map in development. And so we hope that by the end of the summer term, we'll have more of these data stories that will be able to showcase the kind of neighborhood level data that we have in a manner that's more immersive and accessible to audiences. And when it comes to ArcGIS dashboard and experience builder, I don't think we've used those particular programs and integrated into story maps, but it is an interesting idea. It's something that we should look into more.
Okay, great. And then next question is asking, on the neighborhood topic, are the neighborhoods aligned with those used in Ottawa's Neighborhood Equity Index, or those are two different teams defining their neighborhoods differently?
Great question. So no, the NEI, the Neighborhood Equity Index, that was developed in Ottawa, it uses standard geographies. It uses census tracts, and so they're not the same neighborhoods. We were involved in we were on some of the advisory groups that were sitting around that the initial development of the NEI. but because of, you know, the time limitations, it was right around the release of a census cycle. That was, I think, one of the factors leading to their decision to use standard geographies, was to get the data quicker. So it is unfortunate that we do have, because it's a question that comes up a lot, because some of the neighborhood names are the same, and so we try to, you know, there are various sources out there that can be used together and that are useful in different ways. But so no, different neighborhoods, but a group that we collaborate with.
Okay. Thank you so much. Is there any other questions? About the slides and recording, we will post it on a CDP ONS webinar page in the coming days. So you will access to all the kind of presentations and the recording very soon. Okay, so if you have any questions, they share their emails as well, so you can communicate with them through their email if you like in the future. And then if there is no questions, so like wrap up, and I'm going to stop recording.